Masechet Sotah, Daf Mem He. We're continuing the discussion of Aigla, Arufa. And we saw yesterday that there's a machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about how many members of the Sanhedrin need to come to the crime scene. Rabbi Yehuda says 3 and Rabbi Shimon says 5. So now we're going to see yet a different opinion that even more people, important officials, need to come out to the crime scene to initiate the Egla Arufa process. Matnitin de like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov de Tanya Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer ze kanecha zo Sanhedrin shoftecha ze melech vechohen gadol melech tichtiv melech b'mishpat yamid ares kohen gadol tichtiv ubata el hakohanim halviim ve'el hashofet asher yeh b'yamim him. So according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, he learns from the word zekenecha, not the plural that this means 2 or 4. No, zekenecha means, as we're going to see, the entire Sanhedrin has to come out. And shoftecha, that refers to who are the leaders, who is called judges, the king and the Kohen Gadol, everybody, all of the leadership has to come out to that crime scene. Where do we see that a melech is called a shofet? From the pasuk in Mishleh, a king by justice establishes the land. The king is in charge of justice. In fact, the king can adjudicate any case. It goes to a court, but the king is a parallel judicial body. And as we see, many of the kings would be judges as well, like Shlomo HaMelech himself. Kohen Gadol also is called a shofet, as it says. This is in the context of if you don't know a law in your local court, then you come to the Sanhedrin. There's also the source of the law of Zaken Mamre, which was going to be important in a second. That means if the Sanhedrin issues a ruling, and there's some elder there, an important wise leader, a Tamid Chacham in his own right, and he comes and hears the decision of the Sanhedrin. If he should go back home and act and rule in the opposite way against what the Sanhedrin says, he can teach theoretically, I think that this is wrong, but if he actually practices against the Sanhedrin, then he's called Zaken Mamre, a rebellious elder who gets the death penalty, and it's so serious because he's a Zaken, he threatens the authority of the Sanhedrin. In that context, it says, if you don't know a law in your local court, you come to the Kohanim Halviim, that's the phrase in Devarim, the Levitical priests, because some Kohanim are also Leviim, Ve'el HaShofet, and to the Shofet. So you see that the Shofet is part of this group of Kohanim Leviim. Now, other Gemariot say El HaShofet means he's not a Kohen or Levi, but rather a different person, Shofet. But anyway, in this Midrash, he's taking it as the Kohen Gadol, Kohanim Leviim, other Kohanim, and the Shofet, meaning Kohen Gadol, that will be in those times. So here we see that the king and Kohen Gadol are both called Shoftecha. The Kohanim were definitely involved, according to this pasuk, were definitely involved in judging. That's part of their role. Sacrifice is only a small part of their role. They have to do lots of other things, teaching and judging. And so they all have to come to the crime scene. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Bemelech vekohen gadol hu de paligva besenedri ke Rabbi Yehuda ke Rabbi Shimon sibira le odilma besenedri name paligad deika kula sanhedri. A question, according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, I know he disagrees with the opinions in the Mishnah. Is he only disagreeing regarding the king and Kohen Gadol, that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says they have to come, and the opinions of the Mishnah say they don't have to come? But he's agreeing regarding the Sanhedrin, either way, either according to the Yehuda, he agrees that just 3 members of the Sanhedrin have to come, and according to Rabbi Shimon, he says that 5, right? But Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov would agree with one or the other. Or maybe he's disagreeing even on the number of people from the Sanhedrin, that according to Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, it's only 3 or 5. According to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, the entire Sanhedrin has to come. Maybe that's what it means when it says Zekanecha, that they all have to come. So we're going to attempt an answer. Amar Rav Yosef Tashema. The answer is going to be that yes, according to Rav Yosef, the entirety has to come. Mesan zaken mamre abe pagev imra alehen yachot hamra to hamra tamud omar vekamta ve'alita el hamakom melamed shamakom gorem. So here is a question regarding the zaken mamre. we just mentioned, if he goes to the Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim on Harabayit and he hears their ruling and then defies it, then he deserves the death penalty. The question now is, let's say he found the Sanhedrin not in their usual place on Harabayit in Lishkat Hagazit, but rather in a different place, like Bepageh. Bepageh is a known place. It's right on the outskirts of Yerushalayim. It's like a suburb of Yerushalayim. There are many cities in America called Bethpage that are mentioned because of this. Christians, for some reason, were like this city, and so called cities in America by the same name. So it's right outside Jerusalem. What does it mean? Be would be the place of the house. Pageh has something to do with eating or figs, perhaps because they had small figs there. Pag is a small unripe fig, or because it has something to do with Greek eating, because one is allowed to eat kodashim in that place. It's considered a suburb of Yerushalayim. It's so close to it that the Sanhedrin once upon a time extended the borders of Yerushalayim to include it so that one can eat kodashim in that place. All right, so it was an important place. And let's say, for example, the Sanhedrin might be over there at Bethpage, and that's where this Zaken went and asked him this question, and they gave a ruling, and he goes back and he defies the ruling that they gave at Bethpageh. Would that be considered an official disobeying, and he would be called as a Zaken Mamre, capital punishment? Answer is no, because it says only if he goes up to the place, that the place is a necessary cause. The place meaning the usual seat of the Sanhedrin in the Lishkat Hagazit. Only if they give a ruling from there is it considered an official ruling, such that the Zaken Mamre will get the death penalty. If he happened to hear ruling when they were out and doing field work, on a field trip, then the Zaken Mamre would not. Now, this is not the proof continues. The nefuk kama. Now, how many people of the Sanhedrin left? Now, if only some of the members went, let's say, anything less than half, well, then there would be no possibility of calling this person as a Zaken Mamre, because maybe the ones that remained on Harabayit agree with Zaken Mamre. So there would be no possibility. Out of the 70, let's say 30 went out to Bepageh, and they all said A, and then Zaken Mamre gives a ruling as B. Well, then there's no way you could convict him, because he's only went against 30 of the members of Sanhedrin, and there's the majority still back there in Yerushalayim. So that can't be the case. Rather, it must be that all of the Sanhedrin went to Bepageh, and that's why, and they gave a ruling, and that's why that's a chidush. Even though the whole Sanhedrin was there, and the Zaken Mamre went against the majority of the entire of the Sanhedrin, still he's not called Zaken Mamre. So obviously they all went out. Good. Now that's the setup for the proof of Rav Yosef. Ulmai. Why did they leave? Is it just going for fun? They want to all go to a ball game together. They want to do some group bonding activity, and so they all went. That can't be right. If it's just an optional matter, then they can't leave. You can't leave the Lishkat Hagazit empty. You can't even leave it with less than 23 people. As we learned, V'hakatib shorerech agan hasad al yechsad hamazeg. This is pasuk from Shir Hashirim, saying your navel is like a round goblet. No mingled wine is ever wanting. Okay, so this is describing the beloved, but it's a parable, and here we take it as a parable for the Sanhedrin. Shim nisrach echad mehem laset im yesh sham asim u'shosha keneged Sanhedrin ketana yoseh v'im lav eno yoseh. This pasuk generally is compared to the Sanhedrin. In that shorerech, which literally means navel, here means the sarim, right? Your officials, the judges, are like a goblet, meaning because they sit in a semicircle. Sit in a semicircle so that the judges can all see each other, which is important because they all have to speak to and listen to each other's arguments in order to have a proper debate in which they're really listening and considering each other's arguments. And so that's the half circle. And it says, let not the mingle, the mixture be less. So it generally is talking about a mixture of wine, which is usually a third, 2/3 ratio between wine and water. So that is significant. So here the idea is that the entire Sanhedrin is of 71 people, and therefore a third of it is about 23. Now 23 is called a Sanhedrin Ketana. A court of 23 has the authority to give capital punishment. So if someone needs to leave, let's say the 71 judges there, and someone needs to go out, they have to go and take care of something. They are allowed to leave only if there are 23 remaining. He has to look around. There are 23, then that's fine, because that's called Sanhedrin Ketana. But if not, if there's only 23 there, he can't leave. Like if there's 10 men in the minyan, you have to look around. You can't leave if you're the 10th guy. So too here. So this is why, could be why it's comparing it to wine, because just like wine is a third, 2/3 ratio, so too, and the ratio can't be less, so too here you can't leave less than 1/3 of the Sanhedrin there. Well, anyway, the whole point of this is that the entire Sanhedrin cannot leave. There's no possibility, not for a Davar Reshut, just because they have to go and take care of things that they want to do. They want to go for a walk. They want to buy a coffee. They can't do that. They can't all leave. There has to be 23 there. So therefore, it can't be that they're leaving just for the shoot, for fun. Ela peshita lidvar mitzvah. Rather, if the whole Sanhedrin is going somewhere, and we just proved that's the whole Sanhedrin because of the Zaken Mamreh law, then they must be going for a mitzvah. Lemai, what mitzvah would the entire Sanhedrin leave? Lishkat HaGazit 4, Lav the Medidat Aigla, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, must be that they have to go to measure at the crime scene from what's the closest city to the corpse, right? And therefore, this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and so Rav Yosef proves from this step by this proof that we had a number of steps. He proves that yes, the entire Sanhedrin has to go. That's Rav Yosef. He is the third generation Amorah. He's remembered that he became blind. And now his student, fourth generation, Amar le'Abaye, la dirma le'osif al ha'ir v'al ha'azarot. Kiditnan, en mosifin al ha'ir v'al ha'azarot, ela bebet din shel 71. Abaye says, not necessarily. There are other reasons why the whole Sanhedrin would have to leave their place. For example, to add on to a city or to the temple courtyard. As the Mishnah in Sanhedrin says, we only add to the borders of a city or to the temple courtyard with a bet din of 71. So that if the temple courtyard, this actually happened, Herod the Great flattened out the Temple Mount and filled in the sides. That's the Kotel Maravi is one of the walls holding up the extra dirt that he filled in to make the Temple Mount larger. So that would require Sanhedrin to give their official stamp of approval to say, yes, this has the holiness of the Temple Mount. And a city like Yerushalayim, you're allowed to eat Kodashim only within the borders of Yerushalayim. What are the borders of Yerushalayim? Once upon a time, it was only Ir David, which is very small. There's the old city, which is also quite small. What about the new city of Yerushalayim? What about Bet Pageh? So that would be a good example, right? It's a town, a suburb on the outskirts. This would require the Sanhedrin to go out to Bet Pageh. Maybe that's why that's the example, and say, oh, this is now officially part of Yerushalayim, so you could eat Kodashim there. Okay, so therefore Abaye says, yes, I agree that the entire Sanhedrin does sometimes come out for a mitzvah, but that mitzvah does not have to be Egla Arufa. It could be for expanding borders, and therefore there is no proof that this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. All right, so even though we rejected the proof, nevertheless we go back and support Rav Yosef, because there's a braita on his side. Tanya kivated Rav Yosef, misana be pagev imra lehen, kegon shiyasu lemedidat Egla או להוסיף על עיר ועל עריות, יכול תהא המראתו המראה, תמוד לומר וקמת ועלית Ve'melamed shamakom gorem. The Braita says, if the Zaken found the Sanhedrin in Bet Pageh, and then he went against them, rebelled against them. And for example, why did the Sanhedrin go to Bet Pageh? Maybe to measure for an eglah. So you see that the entire Sanhedrin has to go for eglah. They also have to go to expand a city or the courtyard. And so in that case, would the elder be considered liable if he rebels? And the answer is no. You have to go to the place only if he rebels against something that they say in the official place in Lishkat Hagazit. And so, therefore, we conclude with support for Rav Yosef that according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, in fact, the Kohen and the king and the entire Sanhedrin have to go. And this is yet another support for Rambam's idea that the reason for Eglah Arufa is to publicize this murder so that some people may come and call in a tip that they saw something. And certainly if the entire leadership of the nation is going there, entire Sanhedrin, that would make a big impact, make frontline news. Nimsa tamun begal o talui bilad. The Mishnah mentioned that if the corpse was found under a pile of stones, hidden, buried, then that doesn't count. Or if it's hanging on a tree, then also you do not do the Eglah Arufa ceremony. It has to be lying on the ground. Now, lema matitin Rabbi Yehuda vela Rabbanan. What suggests that this Mishnah is the opinion of is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, but that's Rabbi Yehuda, the fourth generation Tana. Not to be confused with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the fifth generation. So the Mishnah seems to be Rabbi Yehuda, this Mishnah, and not the opinion of Rabbanan. What do they say? The Tanya. V'shachachta omer basadeh perat letamun. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Hachamim omrim basadeh lerabot et hatamun. Now we're going to compare two different laws. One is Eglah Arufa, where it says that in Mishnah that if it's hidden, we do not apply Eglah Arufa. And the other is shichicha. If a farmer forgets a sheaf of grain in the field, then he has to leave it for the poor. Okay, now why does it say v'shatoma basadeh? Why basadeh? That excludes if it's hidden. If there's a sheaf there and it's covered over and I forgot it, I can come back as the farmer and I can take it back because it was covered. And that's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Shichicha does not apply to something covered. Hachamim say basadeh. No, that's an extra word. Basadeh comes to include something that's covered. Even if it's covered, right, that's the poor people's prerogative. They get a chance to go through the field and they'll push things away and see if there's any sheaves that have been covered up and left in the field. So, assuming that it's the same law, which we don't have to assume, we're going to reject this in a minute, but can we compare them? That's the question. And therefore, in the Mishnah that said a covered body does not apply to Eglah Arufa. Eglah Arufa does not apply to a covered body. What would be the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that Shichicha does not apply to a covered sheaf. And so that would be consistent. And our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbanan. But we don't want a Mishnah to be only Dat Yachid. So Amar Rav afilu tema Rabbanan hacha minyane dikra hatam meinyane dikra. Rav explains that our Mishnah can even be according to Rabbanan who says that Shechicha does apply to something covered. He still might agree that Eglah Arufa does not apply to a covered body. Why? Because each of these Pisukim, you have to look at the context of the Pisukim in order to figure out what the law is. You can't take it out of context. That's a good methodology. And here's his point. Tichtiv. Ki maseh halal hecha demishdekach. Ba'adama parat letamun. If I had just had the word ki maseh halal, if you find a slain body, then I would have said wherever it's found. And that would mean bodies off. Sometimes they're on the ground, usually they're under the ground. So I would say that Eglah Arufa applies no matter what. The extra word ba'adama comes to say the opposite. It does not apply to a body that's buried. So that fits the context there, and Rabbanan could readily agree to that. And that would be the opinion of the Mishnah. Whereas v'hatam minyanei dikra, regarding shichecha, look at the context. Dichtiv ki tiksod kesirecha basadeh v'shachachta omer shichecha yudumya de kasir ma kasir begalui af shichecha begalui katav rachamana basadeh lerabot et hatamun. And the context of shichecha is when you are reaping, harvesting, you're cutting the grain in your field, and if you forget something. So here the thing that you forgot must be similar to the thing that you're harvesting. Just like the thing that you're harvesting is out in the open. When you cut the grain, then it just falls there and stays up there on the ground so that you can go and collect it. So too, I would assume that shichecha is only that which is uncovered and revealed. Similar to the rest of the grain. And that's why the pasuk, if it has an extra word, basadeh, comes to teach me the opposite, that even if it's covered, you still have to do shichecha. In other words, without that word, from the context, I would say, only if it's uncovered is shicha, so the word basadeh comes say the opposite. In each case, the extra word is coming to tell you the opposite of what I would have thought. But in each case, the thing that I would have thought depends on the context, and that's why each one makes sense in its context. So Rav says, even Rabbanan may very well agree that regarding shichecha, shichecha does apply to sheaf that's covered up. But egladufa does not apply to a corpse that is covered up. Okay, good. Now that we have this Rav's explanation of the Pesukim, let's turn back to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda name tipukle meshichecha dumya de kasir. Rabbi Yehuda, who says that it applies only when it's when it's covered. Shichecha applies only when the sheaf is covered. So why does he need this pasuk here that was quoted above? Shechata omer basadeh, right? Perat letamun. Why is he doesn't have to exclude something that's hidden? In fact, just from the context of the Pesukim themselves, that would be evident. As we said over here, something that you cut, the harvest, is out in the open, so shicha should only apply to something out in the open and not something that's hidden. So that by itself would prove Rabbi Yehuda's point. And we say nachinami, you're right. He doesn't need the word basadeh to tell me the opposite. He doesn't want to say the opposite. The Pesukim by themselves would tell me that it applies, shicha only applies to something out in the open. All right, if so, ve'ela besadeh lamali, then sadeh is an extra word, and we don't want to use it to do the opposite, to limit as Rabbanan do, because Rabbi Yehuda says it only applies to something out in the open. So what is he going to do with the word basadeh? Rabbi Yehuda is going to use the word basadeh to include forgotten standing grain, grain that's left standing. I forgot a patch of grain. I forgot to cut it in the first place, and it's still standing there. Is that called shicha? The answer is yes. It's basadeh. It's still standing up in the field, and I forgot a couple of stalks over there. I have to leave it for the poor. Okay, Rabbanan shechat kama minalehu. Now Rabbanan, who used the word sadeh already for something else, where are they going to derive this law that standing grain also has a law of shichecha? Nafka lehu mi ki tiksor kesirecha basadeh. They learn it from the beginning of the pasuk when you reap the harvest in your field. So that introduction, right? Why do I need that introduction? I mean, isn't this whole law obviously going to be when I'm harvesting? And so that comes to include that the law that if I forgot to harvest part of the field as I'm harvesting, and I forgot part of the field, then shicha also applies to it. So that's how they can derive it. Rabbi Yehuda, what do you need this intro for? What is that necessary for? Damar Rabbi Abu Amar Rabbi Elazar Pirat Safu Omarin Letoch Sedeh Chavero. Oh, he needs us to exclude a case where some sheaves floated, right? They just, flew through the air. Just even a light breeze can take them, and they land in my friend's field. So now my sheaves are in my friend's field. Are those called forgotten as shichecha, and I have to leave them for the poor? The answer is no. It's only kisirecha besadecha. Only if it's in your field and you forgot them, then you have to leave for the poor. But if it floated into your neighbor's field, then you can go and get them back. So that's why he needs this phrase here. V'Rabbanan mebesadeh besadecha. Rabbanan can learn that same law that if it floats into a friend's field, you get to take it back from the fact that it doesn't say sadeh, it says sadecha, your field. So the extra pronoun at the end is sufficient to learn that law. And so what's Rabbi Yehuda going to do with that pronoun? Rabbi Yehuda besadecha lamashma le. Rabbi Yehuda says, I'm not learning something from an extra letter. It's not an extra letter, it's just a replacing of a he with a chaf. I'm not going to learn something from an extra pronoun. It just makes sense to say, it's not the field, it's your field. It happens to be your field, so I'm not going to learn any extra law from that. So in the end, they agree on all these other laws that that are derived from each particle and phrase, and so we accounted for how each of them uses all of the Pesukim. Good. Now, Ba'er Rabbi Yirmiyah asks, he often asks theoretical questions. Safu omarin letoch sadehu mahu, avir sadeh kesadeh dameh, or lav kesadeh dameh. What if it's the opposite case, that some sheaves from wherever, it doesn't really matter where they're from, could be, maybe I already, stacked some sheaves over there, and then some flew back out into the field. So here's the question. If a few sheaves floated into my field, what is that? What is the law? And let's say they are still floating, or they landed on a rock. They landed on something else. They did not land on the ground. So do we consider the airspace of a field like the field itself, and therefore that's called shichicha? Or is it not like the field because it's on top of something else, and so therefore it's not like the field. It will be like I have it in my house or in a place where I'm guarding it, and so it's not like in the field, right? The shicha only applies if it's still out there in the field, but this is not in the field. It's on a rock or it's floating. So that's his question. Amar le Rav Kahana le Rav Papi, v'amri la Rav Kahana le Rav Zevid. Tifshot le'med Rabbi Abhu, amar Rabbi Elazar, amar perat shesafu, omarin letoch sadeh chavero, de chavero in, lesadeh letoch sadehu Allah. So either Rav Kahana or Rav Kahana told Rav Papi, or Rav Kahana told Rav Zevid, he told one of them, I can derive an answer from the statement that we just saw of Rabbi Abhu in the name of Rabbi Elazar, who said that shichecha does not include a case of sheaves that floated from my field to my friend's field. There I can go get it back. So that's the end of his statement. We can infer if it went into his field, then I can get it back. But if it floated into my field, then I do not take it back, and that's called shichicha. And so even though it's floating there on my field or resting on something else, that is not called shichicha. So that might be a good answer, right? And we said no. Safuin munachin la haba enan besadecha veleka. Says no, you're missing the point of Rabbi Abhu. Rabbi Abhu's point was not about the fact that it's floating. The floating was just a way of explaining how it got there, right? You didn't put it there on purpose, that it just floated there itself, right? The point of his statement was to say that it's in his field. It's in someone else's field, and that's why it's exempt. Right, so he says, according to your reasoning, so would you say that if it's in someone else's field and it's floating, then I can take it back. But if it rested on his field, then it's shichicha. But that's not true because we need besadecha only if it's in my field. So it really doesn't matter if it's floating or not. If it's in his field, then I can get it back no matter what. The floating was a side point, so you can't prove it from there. So ela letoch sedeh chavero v'afilu munachin v'hai dekamar safu de la mashkachat la ela besafu. Rather, in truth, according to the Rabbi, even if it was in his friend's field and it rested right on the ground, still I could go get it back. And why does it say safu? Because that's just a typical case. How else would it get there unless it floated there? All right, so that is a rejected proof. And back to Rabbi Yirmiyah's question. If I have some sheaves that came and they're floating on my field or resting on something else in my field, is that called shichicha? Tashema. Let's try to learn it from this Baraita that is found in the Tosefta and Pe'ah. Omer shechazik bo lo licho la'ir ve'inicho Al gabe chavero ushchacha hatachton shichecha ve'elyon eno shichecha. I have a sheaf and I took it into my hands because I wanted to take it to the city. I'm going to go and sell it to the city, maybe show it to a buyer. And then, in the meantime, I'm looking for gathering some other things, and I put it down on another sheaf. I put the sheaf that I have in mind, and I put it down on another one, and then I forgot about it. I left it there. So what is that? What is the law? So the one on the bottom is shichecha. The one on top is not shichecha. Oh, could be different reasons why. We'll try to explain what the reason is. I mean, a simple reading is that the bottom one was there left in the field, so that's shichecha. The top one, I was holding on to it, right? So I want it. I just left it there temporarily, but I did forget it. Okay. Anyway, so the bottom one, the shichecha, the top one is not shichecha. I can go get the top one back. Now, that's Tanakama. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer mishum Rabbi Shimon shenehem enan shichecha hatachton mipnei shu tamun ve'alyon mipnei shehu saf. Rabbi Shimon says neither are shichecha, and each one for a different reason. The lower one because it's covered. And something covered, as this is the law in the Mishnah, a sheaf that's covered, shichecha does not apply to that. And the upper one is because it's floating. It's not literally floating, but it's not on the ground. It's on top of something else. And therefore, shichecha does not apply to it. And so this would be a good point, a good proof here that something floating on top of something, it's in my field, and something floating, shichecha does not apply to that item, right? And this would be true according to both. Ad kan pligi ela betachton, aval b'ayon divrei kol la shichecha. The machloket between Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda is only regarding the bottom one. Regarding the top one, everyone agrees it's not shichecha. So this is a good proof that something floating has not on the ground, and shichecha does not apply to it. But we're going to reject this proof. Maybe in that case, because he's holding on to it, so he acquired it, so it became his. So if something is mine already, once I acquire it, then if I forget it somewhere, I can go and take it back. Right? The shichecha is only about something that's in the field that I never did an act of acquisition, and maybe that's why everybody agrees that it's not shichecha. It's not because it's floating on something, but rather because I held on to it. Now we ask, if that's the reason, then why bother mentioning that he put it on top of another sheaf? Even if he put it down on the ground, it would not be shichecha. If the whole point is I picked it up, I acquired it, so now it's not shichecha anymore. It wouldn't be shichecha, and no matter what, even if I put it down on the ground, it would not be shichecha. So why bother saying it's a case that we put it on top of another one? And Nachiname says, you're right. The reason why instead he put it on top of another one is to teach us a law about the bottom, right? Because the bottom one, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, he says the bottom one is not shichecha because it's covered. So that would only be true if you put it on top of that one. So he wanted to teach us the law about covering, that according to Takama, the one that's covered is shichecha, and the one that's and according to Rabbi Shimon, the one that's on the bottom is not shichecha. But you're right, the top one has nothing to do with it, the fact that it's floating. It's only because he acquired it. Now yes, wait a second. There's the reason. It says the reasoning here because it's floating. So doesn't that mean that the reason why it's not shichecha is because it's floating, not because he acquired it? It gives the reason. And the answer is kesaf. No, it means that it's like it's floating. It's like it has not been put down at all. Because he acquired it, it's as if it's still in his hands. And so it's still like floating, but it doesn't mean that it's a law about anything that's not on the ground. Really, that has nothing to do with it. So there is no proof from this baraita to answer the question of Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now, Amar Abaye, Hareni keben azai beshuke Tiberia. More on this theme, Abaye once went out and said, I am feeling very sharp today, and I am going to be today like Ben Azai in the markets of Tiberia. Who would go? Ben Azai, one of the greatest sages, he knew everything by heart so well, he would go out into the marketplace of Tiberia and says, anybody ask me any question, right? Real question, theoretical question, I can answer it. Abaye says, I'm ready to be challenged today. Ask me anything. So one of the sages had a sharp question and asked him, Let's say you have, back to Egla Arufa, two slain people, one on top of the other, but they're not perfectly aligned, right? One is a little more this way, one is a little more this way, but they're overlapping. Mehechan hu moded. From who do you measure from? From the top guy or from the bottom guy? Now, this is, I hope it's a theoretical a question, but you could see that now we're going to compare this law to the law of the sheaves that are each on top of the other. Now, here's the size of the challenge. Min b'mino have tamun, umin b'mino la have saf, u'me'alyon moded. So we say min b'mino because it's the same type. They're both dead bodies, and so therefore they're of the same type. If something's of a different type, then it makes sense to call it covered, right? I have a clay cover covering a bowl of soup, right? So then that's called a cover because it's of a different item. But and the same thing with the thing on the floating, right? If I have a sheaf floating on a rock, that's two different items. So clearly you'd say that is not on the ground; it's on a rock. That's so when it's min b'she'eno mino, it's much clearer. But here we're talking about where it's the same item, right? If I have a pile of sheaves, then do I call the one on the bottom floating? And not really floating; it's just a whole pile, right? And the one on the bottom, is it hidden? Is it buried? Or we wouldn't call buried because it's all the same item. Or maybe not. Maybe you would call it buried and you would call it floating. So that's what we're going to discuss. All possibilities. Since I have the same type of item, also a body and another body, as so what I consider that it is in fact. Even though it's a body on top of a body, it's still considered something that's hidden. I am going to consider it hidden, and Egla Arufa does not apply to something hidden. But min b'mino is not floating, that I would not consider the top one floating since it's resting on something that is its own kind, so it's not considered floating, and therefore I would measure from the top one. Or min b'mino have saf, umin b'mino la have tamun mitachton moded. Maybe the other way around, that if something that's the same type is considered, even though it's the same type, it is considered floating, the top body, even though it's on another body, it's the same type, still it's not on the ground, so I'm going to consider that one floating, and so I'm not going to count from that one, because it's like it's hanging in the tree. Min b'mino is not tamun, and even though the bottom one, even though it's covered by something, but since it's covered by something of the same type, so that's not called that it's covered, because it's the same type, so therefore the bottom one does count, and I would measure from the bottom one. That's the other way around. Or maybe neither. Min b'mino have tamun, min b'mino have saf, v'la mitachton moded, v'la me'alyon moded. Maybe neither of them count because when it's of the same type, even though it's the same type, it's considered covered, and even though it's the same type, it is considered floating, and therefore I can't count not from the top and not from the bottom. There's also the fourth possibility that that both of them do count, and then you'd have to figure out how to measure from both the top and both the bottom. So these are all the different sides of the question, and you can see Abaye really got himself into a mess. He asked for a challenge, and he sure got one. Let's see how he's going to come up with an answer on the spot. Amarle tini tuha. Oh, that's a simple one. There's an explicit tosefta. What, you don't know? Don't you know the tosefta that answers that question? Well, here's why it's why he's he is deriving one thing from the other. It's really not explicit. It's about the case of shichicha that he's bringing in and comparing. So you see his brilliance here. It says, "Omer shechazik bo." לא לכל לעיר, וניחול גבי חברו ושכחו, התחתון שכחה, והעליון אינו שכחה. We're re-quoting the Braita, that Tosefta that we just said. Someone is holding an omed because he's going to bring it into the marketplace, but he put it down on another sheaf, and he forgot it there. So Tanakama says the bottom one is shichicha, and the top one is not shichicha. Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omer, Bishum Rabbi Shimon, shenehem enam shichicha, tachton b'nei shu tamon, v'alyon b'nei shu saf. He says neither of them are shichicha because the bottom one is covered, and the top one is floating. Sevado adahani taneh Rabbi Yehuda sivira lehu, damar basadeh perat letamun. So we are thinking right now, let's follow the assumption that both of them, both Tanaim here, Tanakama Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, agree with Rabbi Yehuda, who said, when it says basadeh, it means not, if it's concealed, then it's not considered, then the shicha does not apply to something that's concealed. Now, if we follow that assumption, then here we can have an answer. Rabbi can have an answer. This is min bimino because I took one sheaf and I forgot it and I put it on top of another sheaf. Have tamun. It is considered covered, right? In other words, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says it is covered. Umor sabar lo have tamun, and Tanakama said tachton is shichicha because it's min b'mino, so it's not considered covered. And so you see, I gave here's an answer to your question. Your question, right? Your question was about two bodies, one on top of the other. That would be subject to the same machloket as this. That according to the Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, since they're two of the same type, the bottom one is considered covered, so you wouldn't count it from the bottom one. And according to Tanakama, it's not considered covered, so you would count from the bottom one. All right, so it looks like he has an answer, at least to the bottom, at least regarding the bottom person. And we say, no, that not necessarily good proof, because you can interpret this braita that's really about a different issue. The Rabbanan kerabanan, Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda keRabbi Yehuda. The machloket in the Tosefta and Pe'ah is precisely whether we should follow Rabbi Yehuda regarding Egla Arufa or not. So that, right, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbanan, back in Egla Arufa. So Rabbanan, that means the Tanakama of the Tosefta and Pe'ah, who says that the bottom one, even though it's covered, still it's considered shichicha. That follows Rabbanan, who says regarding Egla Rufa, even if the body is covered, still you apply the law of Egla Rufa. Whereas Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, who says that the bottom sheaf, since it's covered, is not shichicha, shichicha does not apply to something covered, he would follow Rabbi Yehuda in Egla Rufa, that says that a covered body, the Egla Rufa, does not apply to that, just like it does not apply to the covered sheaf. And so that is the machloket, whether or not you follow Rabbi Yehuda. But everybody would agree that if you follow Rabbi Yehuda, then even though it's min b'mino, it is considered something covered, and that would be in fact a partial response to the original question that was posed back up here to Abaye. And it is a good comparison, that min b'mino is covered, and therefore we have one body on top of the other, so the bottom one is considered covered, and if we follow Rabbi Yehuda, which the Mishnah does follow Rabbi Yehuda, then the bottom one would not, the Egla Rufa would not apply to the bottom one, and you would only measure from the top one. So it is, so we do have a partial resolution. Now we ask about this reading. If this is, if in fact they're only arguing about whether we follow Rabbi Yehuda or not, then why does the Braita bother talking about a case where there's one sheaf on top of another sheaf? Even if it was covered with dirt or with pebbles, it would be the same thing. They would be arguing, the sheaf is covered, so do we follow Rabbi Yehuda or not? And the answer is inachinami. You're right. We could have that would have the machloket between Tanakama and Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda would still apply if it was covered with dirt. But the reason why it uses a case of sheaf over a sheaf, but it wanted to add an extra chidush to show you the extent to which Rabbi Yehuda would say that something covered is considered covered and exempt, that even if it's covered by its own type of substance, that's considered concealed, and the law of sheaves, of shichcha, does not apply to the one under, and certainly the law of egla arufa. That's actually what Rabbi Yehuda is talked about, that the law of egla arufa would not apply to the item, to the body underneath another body. Good. Now, next, baraita, tenor banan, halal velo hanuk. The word halal means a slain person, implying that he was killed violently with a metal weapon, but not if he was strangled, like in a chokehold. Halal velo mefarper, and he has to be killed, not if he's still twitching and almost dead. Egla arufa only applies when he's totally dead. Ba'adama velo tamun begal. Ba'adama has to be on the ground and not under a pile of stones. Nofel velo talu beilan, that he has fallen and not if he's still hanging in a tree. Basadeh velo saf al pnei hamayim, he has to be in the field and not floating on water. That's all Tanakama. Rabbi Elazar omer becholan im haya halal orfi. And Rabbi Elazar disagrees and says in all these cases, as long as he was slain with a metal weapon, then that's egla arufa. So he agrees with the first derasha, but disagrees with the rest. Doesn't matter. It only matters how he's killed. Doesn't matter where you find the body. Tanya, Amar Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda, Amru lo Rabbi Elazar. So the sages argued with Rabbi Elazar and said, wouldn't you agree that if he was strangled and then his body thrown into onto a garbage pile, that you would not do egla arufa? Right? You agree to that because here he's strangled. So alma halal velo hanuk. So you agree with the first rasha that it has to be killed with a sword and not strangled. Then why don't you agree with the rest of the derashot? Each one is inferring another law from another word in the pasuk, and just like you learned from some law from the word halal, learn also from adama that not if it has to be on the ground, not under the ground, has to be fallen, not in a tree, has to be in a field and not on water. Rabbi Elazar would answer, no, actually the word halal appears twice there, and that's why he's learning something from halal, because of the repetition. But all the other words, you just need them for themselves, in and of themselves, to describe the case, but you're not going to learn any diuk from the word if it appears only once. Next, nimsa samuch lasfar o la'ir sheruba nochrim, tichtiv ki maseh perat lemasui. Mishnah taught that if it's found close to a border or close to a city where the majority of the people are not Jewish, then you do not apply egla arufa. Why? Because it says ki maseh. If you happen to find a dead body in an unusual circumstances, oh look, wait, there's a dead body here, and that excludes a place where it's common. And apparently, in the olden days, it was like the Wild West, and people would be murdered often and thrown somewhere in a non-Jewish city or on the border of a different country. So apparently around Roman times, people would be buried in all different places in non-Jewish cities, and in Jewish cities they were more careful. You could see from this law of egla arufa just how much the Torah cares about even just one murder, unsolved murder. It's a very serious thing, and you rile everybody up to figure it out. But if not for that, then people can be murdered, and there's and nobody cares. Then it's going to happen more often. Just now, last week in the news, they were out west looking for 2 bodies of people who were murdered, and they went to some field somewhere and they found 7 bodies, the 2 that they were looking for, and 5 others that they weren't looking for, that people that had been murdered or something that just happened to be there. So Maybe in some places this is going on even today. Anyway, that's the reason Egla Arufa, only if it's uncommon, not in a place where finding bodies is common. Or le'ir she'en ba bet din. Or you don't do Egla Arufa. Well, okay. If there's a city that does not have a bet din of 23, then you do not measure to that city. Because the next step is going to be that you're going to take the elders of that city and you're going to bring them out to the site of the murder. Now, if there's no bet din, there's no ziknei ha'ir, you can't do the next step, so it will be impossible to use that city. Now, the continuation of the Mishnah then goes on and says the same law again, that you do not measure to a city that doesn't have a bet din. So we say Peshita kevan detana la'ir she'en ba bet din, anayadana en modedin ela la'ir sheyesh ba bet din. So since you already, isn't this obvious? Since you already taught that it has to be, you only measure to a city that has a bet din, then I know that I'm not going to count. I can't measure to any city that doesn't have a bet din. So why is the Mishnah saying it again? Hakamash de kedatanya minayin she'im nimsa samuch le'ir she'en ba betin she'menichin otam modedin le'ir she'yesh ba betin tamodov v'lakechu ziknei ha'ir hahi mikol makom. Is to teach us that if the closest city does not have a bet din, it's not that you don't do Egla Arufa at all. No, you just keep going. You go to the next closest city. As the Baraita says, how do you know that if the closest city doesn't have a bet din, that you forget about that city and you keep going and you measure to the closest city that has a bet din? Because it says, go and get the elders of that city, right? So that city, any city, whichever one is the closest. So that's why the Mishnah is emphasizing that and has to say that law again. It's not that it's not that you cancel the law of Egla Arufa totally. Okay, next and final Mishnah for today. Nimsa mechuvan ben shene shete ayarot, shetehen meviot shete eglot. Debre Rabbi Eliezer. What happens if you take a measurement from the body and you find that there are two cities that are exactly equidistant from the body? Both of them have a bet din. And this is it's exact to the inch, right? This shows the precision of their measurement, like you do for zoning laws. You wouldn't lose an inch of your property, so you do an exact measurement, and it comes out equidistant. Then both cities have to bring a heifer and do the whole Egla Arufa ceremony, according to the Rabbi Eliezer. Jerusalem never brings an Egla Arufa. We'll see why. Even if that's the closest city, and it certainly does have a bet din, they are exempt. This part gets a little gory. If someone is killed and their head is cut off, and you find the head in one place and the rest of the body in another place, from which do you measure? What do you do? So, according to the Rabbi Eliezer, you take the head and you bring it to the body. The body is the main thing, and so you bring the head closer and then you measure from there. However, Rabbi Akiva Omer Haguf etzel harosh, he says no, the head is the main thing. That's where your mind is. Your head, your body is just you need it to walk around and to function, but the head is the main part of you, and so bring the body to the head. It's interesting philosophical argument here. When you point to yourself, do you point to your body or to your head? Okay, now where precisely on the body do we measure, right? Because the body takes up some space, and maybe the head is closer to one city and the feet are closer to another city. Rabbi Eliezer says from his belly button. That's the center, the middle of the body. Rabbi Akiva says from his nose. That's where you breathe from. That's your life force. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer makom shenasa halal mesavaro. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says from the place where he was killed, which is his neck. His head was cut off, and so it's his neck was cut, and so that's where the wound is. That's how he died, and so we measure from there. Okay, there's a bit of a question. If you say it's from his body, then wouldn't that mean actually it's quite consistent. According to Rabbi Eliezer, you take the head and bring it to the body because he says it follows the belly button. According to Rabbi Akiva, however, he says you bring the body to the head because he says you have to follow the nose. And so it makes sense that you'd have the head there and you'd bring the other one along with it. Okay, but the Gemara is going to say that this seems to be redundant and give a different explanation of the head and body part of this. Okay, my Tamad Rabbi Eliezer. What is the reason that Rabbi Eliezer says that you bring two of them if it's equidistant? Number one, he assumes that you can be precise in your measurement to that extent that you're actually going to bring two of them. And even though the pasuk says you bring kerovah, the closest one, he says that means even kerovot, even if it's plural, the closest cities, if they're equidistant, then you bring both. Jerusalem is exempt. The pasuk says if you found a slain person in the land that God has given you to possess it, lidishta. So that means it only applies in one of the tribes that are inherited. Whereas Jerusalem, even though it's within the tribe of Binyamin, is an international city, or at least a nationalized city. It belongs to all of the Shevatim equally, because that's where the Bet HaMikdash is going. That's the capital, so everybody has equal access to the capital. Kind of like Washington D.C. is its own entity, is not actually part of the state. Nimsa Rosha b'makom. Now the next part, if the head is in one place and the body is in another place, b'may kami palge. Ilem alinyan medida kami palge ha medikatani sefa me'ayin hayu modedim meklal deresha la b'medida askinan. Are we arguing about where to measure from the head or from the body? If so, we don't need it, because in the next part it already says where do they measure from, and one says the belly and one says the nose. So I know from that alone that I'm going to measure. What's the point? Why you need to tell me I should bring the head and bring it to the body? Why do I have to bring the head to the body? Measuring from the belly button. Or why do I have to bring the body to the head for the Bi Akiva? Measuring from the nose anyway, so I could leave the body there, right? So if it's just about measurement, this clause is not needed. Rabbi Yitzchak says this is talking about a met mitzvah. Does not seem to be the pashat of the Mishnah, because the Mishnah is about the laws of Eglah Arufa. But since it's redundant here, so Rabbi Yitzchak says this is talking about met mitzvah. If you find a corpse and there's no one to bury it, the law is that it acquires its place, right? Even if it's in the road or in some field, then you bury him right there, and he by dying in that spot acquires that plot. He doesn't have to pay for it, and that field owner has to say, okay, right, you can bury him here, and he gets to stay there. You don't move him to a different place. But then the question is, if his head and his body are in different places, then which parcel of land has he acquired? So according to Rabbi Eliezer, you take his head and you bring it to his body and you bury it in the place of the body. Rabbi Akiva says the opposite. The head is the main thing, and you bring the head and you bring the body over to the head, and the spot he acquires is where his head is. Asil. What is the essence of the machloket? That it's that Rabbi Eliezer thinks that the body dies and falls in its place, so that's where he died. That's why he it gets to acquire that piece of land. Now the head is round, and if it was cut off, it might roll down the hill, but that's just after he died. So he doesn't acquire. He only acquires the spot where he actually expired, and that would be where the body was. However, Rabbi Akiva says, no, where as soon as his head is chopped off, he's dead. That's definition. One definition of being dead is not having a head. And the body, however, sometimes the body, just like a chicken, can keep running without a head. Apparently, also a human being. I don't know how far he's going to get, but even if it's just a few steps, so the body is just going on its own. But he actually already died where the head fell. So you follow the head and not the body. And that would explain the reasoning why the Met Mitzvah acquires this place or that place. Now, Me'ayin Hayumodidin, which part of the body do we use to measure? B'mai Kami Palgeh, what's that the essence of their machloket about whether you count for you do it from the navel or from the neck or from the nose? Mor sabar ikar chayuta be'apeh, mor sabar ikar chayuta be'tibureh. Now, the Rabbi Akiva says the essence of a person's life is his nose. It's breathing. All the words for soul to be someone alive is nefesh, neshama, ruach. These all have to do with breath, the breath of life. Right? Hashem puts in Adam the breath of life. It's breathing that defines being alive. No breathing, not alive. So therefore, the main essence of a person's life is his nose, where you breathe from. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer says, no, it's his navel. That's the essence of his life, the digestive system. You need to eat to live. So we follow where his stomach is. So maybe the machloket here between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva is parallel to this another set of Tanaim about how is an embryo formed. Merosho vechen hu omer me'aimi ata gozi ve'omer gozi nizrech v'ashlichi. Tanakama in this baraita says that an embryo is formed from its head. The head is formed first, and you know that because in Tehillim it says, "Out of my mother's womb you pulled me, gozi." Gozi, and this word gozi appears in another place. Gozi nizrech, cut off your hair. Nizrech, like nazir, it means a crown or head, something on the head. And therefore, you see, gozi means head, and you say, from my mother's womb, you are gozi, and that means head. So therefore, embryo is formed from its head. This might be based on if you see pictures of an embryo, you see the head is rather quite formed and recognizable in early stages, when the body just looks like a little tail. So that could have be based on that. Abba Shaul omer mitiburo umeshalech shorsho elach. Abba Shaul says no, the embryo is formed from its navel, from its belly button, and then it spreads out from there in all different directions. It gets limbs, and limbs here and limbs there, and a head. And this also has scientific basis, because the umbilical cord, where it gets its sustenance from, goes right into is the belly button, and so that could also makes sense. So we can relate this machloket to the previous machloket, that Rabbi Akiva, he would say that the head he would agree with the head being formed first. The head is formed first, and that's the essence of life, and therefore you're going to measure from the nose. Whereas Abba Shaul said the embryo is formed from the belly, and therefore that's the essence of life, so you're going to measure from the belly button. So should we match them up? We never like to constrict opinion, so we say afilu tema Abba Shaul. Really, it could be everybody's agrees with Abba Shaul. Ad kan la kamar Abba Shaul elanyan yesira. But Abba Shaul, he was talking about the way an embryo is created. There he said, just happens to be, it comes from the middle and expands outwards. Dechi mittesad valad memesiate mittesad. When it's formed, it forms from the middle. Avalinan chiyuta. But if you're talking about its life, the source of its life, tekula ama be'apehu tichtiv kol asher nishmat ruach hayim be'apav. That has certainly his breath, as it says, describing someone alive, anyone in whose nostrils the breath of the spirit of life is in. So you see, the definition of life is being able to breathe. This is an essential Gemara for the definition of death and organ donation. Because if you say, as this Gemara does say, that the definition of being alive is breathing, and the definition of being dead is not breathing, then that means someone who is not breathing is considered dead, even if the rest of their body is functioning. For example, their heart is still beating, right? If someone is brain dead, brain stem dead, then their brain stem is what controls breathing, and so they are not breathing on their own. Whereas the heart does not need a brain to be pumping. The heart beats on its own. So if you have a person whose heart is beating on its own but is not breathing on their own because their brain stem has died, then according to this, they are considered legally dead, and that would allow for the possibility of organ donation. So this is a very important Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Mimakom shena'aseh halal mi savaro. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, he said, different from the other two, that you measure from his place of his neck. Why does he say that? Kidichtiv latet otach el savere chalele reshaim. The pasuk in Yechezkel says to lay you upon the necks of the wicked who are to be slain. So you see, it says savar and halal. So that shows that how does someone become a halal? The place of death of, especially for, and we just learned that this law only applies if someone is killed by a sword. And cut at the neck. So the place of being killed is at the neck, and that's why we measure from the neck. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.